Hey everybody, this is a section from a chapter from Marx and Marxism by Iring Fetscher. The chapter is titled "The Young and Old Marx." The Young and the Old Marx. Section 1: Introduction to the Problem. In the old European social democratic parties, Karl Marx was honored as a great economist, as the writer of Capital, a book intended to prove the inevitable decline of the capitalistic system with scientific rigor. In the perspective of Lenin's interpretation of Marxism and the activities of the Communist International, Marx appeared to be first of all a political thinker who taught the working class to create the working class's own organization as a basis for the seizure of political power. Under this perspective, the critique of the Gotha program was praised as one of Marx's most important contributions. However, in the development of the communist Weltanschauung of the socialist and communist parties, Friedrich Engels and even Joseph Dietzken were far more significant and influential than Marx himself. In part, this view results because the young Marx, that is, Marx the philosopher, is almost unknown and absolutely neglected until the publications of Karl Korsch and Georg Lukács in 1923. The brilliant writings of Marx, known to some experts, were held to be brilliant but not genuinely Marxist, and as such they were at best believed to be significant for our evaluation of the genesis, not for the understanding of Marx's mature works. In this respect, the words with which Iring, in his 1918 biography of Marx, ended the chapter on his early writings are characteristic of the then prevailing appreciation of the young Marx. Quote, in shadowy contours, we observe an outline of socialist society beginning to form. In the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher, Marx is still plowing the philosophical field, but in the furrows turned over by his critical plowshare, the first shoots of the materialist conception of history began to sprout, and under the warm sun of French civilization they began to flower. End quote. Franz Mehring. That's from Franz Mehring's books, Karl Marx, The Story of His Life. Consequently, the philosophical writings of Marx were understood as the first steps towards a scientific method of historical materialism that obviously was not considered to be a philosophy, and thus Marx's early writings were inevitably considered, quote, immature, end quote, whereas even the publication of a socialist as theoretically feeble as Kautsky were taken to be far-reaching applications of the supposedly scientific method inaugurated by Marx. Karl Korsch and Georg Lukács had grown up in an entirely different intellectual climate. Karl Korsch and Lukács not only knew the Neo-Kantian theory of knowledge, but also Hegel's philosophy. Moreover, Lukács was familiar with the problems of the differentiation between the natural sciences on the one side and the humanities and the social sciences on the other, through Lukács' early contacts with such outstanding representatives of Neo-Kantianism as Emil Lask and Max Weber. I gotta look up Emil Lask, so 1 second. Emil Lask. Emil Lask was a German philosopher, a student of Heinrich Rickert, who I know is a prominent Neo-Kantian, at Freiburg University. Emil Lask was a member of the Southwestern School of Neo-Kantianism. It says Lask was, this is Wikipedia, Lask was an important and original thinker whose rewarding work is little known due to his early death, but also because of the decline of Neo-Kantianism. Lask's published and some unpublished writings were collected in 3 volumes edited by his pupil, Eugen Herrigel, with a notice by Lask's former teacher, Rickert, in 1923 and 1924. Lask is of interest to philosophers because of his uncompromising attitude to historians of philosophy, because of his influence on Georg Lukács and the young Martin Heidegger in Being and Time of 1927. Heidegger credited Lask with being the only person to have taken up Edmund Husserl's investigations, quote, positively from outside the mainstream of phenomenological research, end quote, pointing to Husserl's logical investigations from of 1900 to 1901 as an influence on Lask's Die Logik der Philosophie und die Kategorientheorie Lehre of 1911 and Die Lehre vom Urteil, 1912. Emil Lask's ideas were also influential in Japan due to Hegel, who lived and taught there for several years. So back to the text. The logic of inquiry within these disciplines could no longer be conceived of as a universally applicable theory, and consequently difference between causal and or functional analysis on the one hand and the interpretation of cultural phenomena in their complete totality, Sinnverstehen, or Sinnverstehen. Is that a B or an H? I can't really tell. On the other was, from now on, held to be fundamental. Wilhelm Dilthey, no less than Max Weber, belonged to the great inspiring masters. Wilhelm Dilthey was a German philosopher who lived from 1933 to 1911. Dilthey is best known for the way he distinguished between the natural and human sciences. Wilhelm Dilthey defined the human sciences broadly to include both the humanities and the social sciences, whereas the main task of the natural sciences, as Dilthey found them, was to arrive at law-based causal explanations. Wilhelm Dilthey projected the core task of the human sciences to be that of providing an understanding of the organizational structures and dynamic forces of human and historical life. It will be shown that this distinction is not so sharp as to rule out causal explanations in particular human sciences such as psychology, political theory, and economics. It mostly delimits the scope of explanations in these fields. Dilthey's aim was to expand Kant's primarily nature-oriented critique of pure reason into a critique of historical reason that can also do justice to the social and cultural dimensions of human experience. Understanding the meaning of human historical events requires being able to organize them in their proper context and to articulate the structural uniformities that can be found in this way. Dilthey's reflections on the human sciences, historical contextualization, hermeneutics influenced many subsequent thinkers such as Husserl, Heidegger, Cassirer, Gadamer, and Ricoeur. I don't know if I'm saying any of those names right. Recently, there has been some attention given to the ways in which Wilhelm Dilthey's empirical approach to experience influenced Carnap in his early attempts to overcome metaphysics in favor of more analytical methods. End footnote, or not end footnote, back to the text, that's what I meant to say. Consequently, Lukács and Korsch, illuminated by the ideas of this most recent epoch of the history of German philosophy, and with the intention of helping the revolutionary consciousness to an adequate and deeper understanding of the revolutionary consciousness's own contemporary status, went back to Hegel and the young Marx, although Lukács and Korsch did not and could not know all early writings of Marx of that time. The reproaches against Lukács and Korsch from the side of the social democratic and communist orthodox writers were raised as a defense. Not only was the older interpretation of Marx's theory as an economic theory threatened, so also was a general method of historical investigation. Lukács and Korsch insinuated that Marx had cast the problem of the bourgeois philosophy into a more adequate mold with deeper understanding that could have been achieved by the bourgeois philosophers themselves and on a new basis, which definitely opened up a way for final solution. To the ideologues of the social democratic and communist parties, it still appeared necessary to emphasize the radical difference between the bourgeois and the proletarian revolution on the one hand, and the two Weltanschauungen on the other hand. Lukács and later Max Horkheimer, Walter Benjamin, Herbert Marcuse, and Theodor Adorno even thought that to stress the continuity of the bourgeois and the revolutionary movements was most important because of the fact that the German and Italian bourgeoisie were in the age of fascism, about to betray the ideals of their own past. They endeavored to show to the bourgeois intellectuals the gulf between the liberal principles and humanitarian aspirations of the early bourgeoisie and the meaning and scope of the modern barbarianism, which grew out, as they thought, of the antagonism of contemporary capitalist society and led to fascism. Both the dangers of fascism and the reappraisal of Hegel's philosophy led to a new interpretation of Marx's early writings. Humanism, a genuine constituent of Marx's early works could no longer be taken for granted. It was negated in practice and disavowed in theory by the fascist movements as well as Stalinism. Thus, the time was obviously ripe to win the young Marx as an ally in the fight against these forms of rising barbarism. This in turn necessitated reappraisal of Hegel's philosophy. Therefore, the authors just mentioned set out to fight against the myth of Hegel as the Prussian state philosopher. They took up an issue with which Marx and Engels had already dealt with, but which had again become accentuated by the mystification of Hegel in works like those of Kuno Fischer and other authors of Imperial Germany. Never even heard that name before. Kuno Fischer. K-U-N-O-F-I-S-C-H-E-R. Let's see if anything comes up for that. That might be an obscure one. Wikipedia says Kuno Fischer, who lived from 1824 to 1907, was a German philosopher, a historian of philosophy, and a critic. Under the section of Kuno Fischer's philosophy, it says, one of Fischer's most significant and lasting contributions to philosophy was the use of the empiricism/rationalism distinction in categorizing philosophers, particularly those of the 17th and 18th centuries. Citation needed. These include John Locke, George, how the fuck do you say his name? Berkeley, and David Hume in the empiricist category, and René Descartes, Baruch Spinoza, and G.W. Leibniz in the rationalist category. Empiricism, it is said, claims that human knowledge is derived from sensation, i.e. experience, while rationalism claims that certain knowledge can be acquired before experience through pure principles. Although influential in more recent times, this distinction has been questioned. Bracket, by whom, question mark, according to Wikipedia, as anachronistic, and it's fair to represent precisely the exact claims and methodologies of the philosophers it categorizes. It's pretty interesting that a person who I've never heard of before is responsible for such an important distinction in like the teaching, in like the pedagogy and history of philosophy. That's interesting. Back to the text. While the representatives of positivist neoliberalism denounced Hegel and with him Rousseau and other modern philosophers of democracy, these authors emphasized the perspicacity with which Hegel had anticipated the pitfalls and inconsistencies of the liberal society and liberal society's elementary dynamics, and with which he had already seen through the liberal formulation of the rights of man. The interpretation of Marx's early writings, of course, depended to a great extent on the evaluation of the bourgeois philosophical tradition, whereas Lukács and Korsch interpreted Marx's intentions as an attempt to solve by a radical theory and revolutionary praxis the problems with which the bourgeois philosophy could not come to grips. Marx was, according to the doctrines of social democrats and communists, the founder of a scientific proletarian Weltanschauung that they contrasted emphatically with the Weltanschauung of the bourgeoisie. Because both political movements, social democracy and communism, intended to create their own Weltanschauung, each of course with a specific character, social democracy and communism had to stress the difference between Hegel and the young Marx on the one hand and the old Marx on the other, and consequently both had to de-emphasize Marx's early writings. To the ideologues of Stalinism, the discussion of and references to the young Marx were inexpedient because Marx in his early writings spoke of the proletarian revolution and socialism as a means for the realization of a genuinely human society, not as absolute and dogmatic standards. The new Soviet society, labeled socialist by its own ideologues, was threatened to be exposed to criticism based on the characteristics Marx attributed to a truly, quote, human society, end quote. This conception obviously and definitely stood, among other things, in sharp contrast to the conception of the state and law as it was propagated by the Stalinist orthodox writers. In the light of the motives I have just mentioned, which functioned as an impediment to the incorporation of the young Marx into the theories and doctrines of the labor movement, the rather late and first publication of the important parts of his early writings, above all the philosophic and economic manuscripts, and the German ideology, both first published in 1932, was less relevant. To my understanding, I mean, both of these things are kind of like... maybe not, I don't know as much about the philosophic and economic manuscripts, but I think, what's his name? Shit, I cannot think of his name. Terrell Carver, who wrote like a book about like the history of the German ideology. It kind of like describes the ways that it's kind of like a, I don't know, kind of like a compilation that has a very like political history. Like the publication of the German ideology has a very political history, and I'm not exactly sure of the details of that, but I'm just noting that that's important. One should not forget that some of the early writings, like Marx's contribution to the Deutsch Französische Jahrbucher, were previously known, and that leading social democrats were well informed about Marx's literary bequest without pressing for publication. Not until recently were there signs of a reappraisal of the young Marx in the, quote, socialist, end quote, states, a reappraisal which was triggered, however, as Adam Schaff once remarked, by the intense research and studies of Western scholars. Adam Schaff was an important Marxist philosopher in Poland. Wikipedia says Adam Schaff was a Polish Marxist philosopher who lived from 1913 to 2006. Damn, I didn't know homeboy lived that long. It says, of Jewish origin, Schaff was born in Lemberg, now Lviv, into a lawyer's family. Adam Schaff studied economics at the École des Sciences Politiques et Économiques in Paris, and philosophy in Poland, specializing in epistemology. In 1945, Adam Schaff received a philosophy degree at Moscow University, and in 1948, Adam Schaff returned to Warsaw University. Adam Schaff was considered the official ideologue of the Polish United Workers' Party, especially during its Stalinist period. Adam Schaff was a member of the Polish Academy of Sciences and of the Club of Rome. I was going to say that I have a piece by Adam Schaff on this channel because Adam Schaff had a piece in Erich Fromm's edited volume on socialist humanism. So that's Adam Schaff. Moreover, back to the text. Moreover, it seems to me that the achieved status of the Soviet society and the perspectives of, as well as the planning for, a transition to a, quote, real, end quote, communist society nowadays also favor a frank confrontation with the young Marx. The disparity between contemporary socialist states and Marx's conception of a real human society can be more easily described today as the distance between the socialist phase and the terminal communist stage of the transition. This now sounds more credible than at an early stage of the movement originated by Marx. At that point, this transition was still so far removed in time that the distance between socialism and communism would have been considered only as a contrast. As a footnote or a side note, the distinction between socialism and communism is a Leninist innovation and is not to be found in Marx. Several Marxist scholars say that. They use those words. Marx and Engels use those words interchangeably. Undoubtedly, we should also consider the fact that the misery in which the working class had to live for decades in capitalist societies was, by and large, done away with by the development of modern techniques and by the political and social interventions of the state. So that the more subtle and more critical arguments of the young Marx, after having been used by the new left, were welcomed as an enrichment to the polemical arsenal of the communist parties as well. Section 2. The meaning of Marx's early writings for an interpretation of the critique of political economy. The historical distance which separates the present from the political, social, and economic problems characteristic of Marx's time has grown so great that we are at least able to come to grips with his critical theory as a whole. I do not think that this is due to its obsolescence or outdatedness. Rather, I believe that Marx's theory is worn out by the various kinds of interpretation which were placed on parts rather than on the whole of his theoretical framework. It seems to me, then, that as a consequence, the appreciation of the whole of Marx's writings was best and most successfully provided in those cases where individual critical scholars, without a close party affiliation and therefore without any total allegiance to an ideological body of doctrine, turned to Marx. The insight, by the way, that independence from organizations and parties is an indispensable precondition for any genuinely scientific work, was reiterated many times by Engels, for example, in a letter to August Bebel on the 1st of April 1891, where Engels wrote, quote, "You within the party need the socialist science, and this science cannot prosper without liberty," end quote. The grasping of the meaning of Marx's theory as a whole, with all of Marx's theory's complexities and problems, has been impeded, among other things, by the fact that his method was reduced to, quote, "historical materialism," end quote, and that historical materialism was conceived as a particular case of the application of so-called, quote, "dialectical materialism," end quote. To my understanding, dialectical materialism is a term coined by Plekhanov, although it's often attributed to Engels. I may be wrong about that. I'm not an expert. Someone might want to dispute that, but that seems like what is the historical record to me. The mere inclusion of Marx's critical theory into a comprehensive and allegedly scientific Weltanschauung made an adequate understanding of all its complexities impossible. Isolated elements of Marx's theory were integrated into the system of a supposedly global materialistic Weltanschauung at the very time that Marxist intellectuals were integrated into a hierarchically structured party machine, which became more petrified the farther the time of revolutionary transition was left behind, the more the movement changed into a new system of domination. Adam Schaff alluded to these contingencies when Adam Schaff wrote that the epoch of the personality cult had prevented many intellectuals from adequately appreciating Marx's early writings. New section, which is marked off by just 3 stars. After these introductory remarks, let me go down to the substance of the problem and allow me first to state a thesis, which I shall try to prove during the remainder of my essay. As in the works of most great thinkers, one unique and central issue can be traced through the whole of Marx's work, that is, in his scientific investigations and his instructions for praxis. One fundamental problem was uppermost during all his lifetime. The central problem is the question, how did it happen that the bourgeois revolution did not achieve the bourgeois revolution's proclaimed aims, and why, despite formally legalized freedoms, individuals came in the course of the division of labor and modern market mechanism to be dominated by social processes which prevailed behind their backs and prevented everybody from achieving a status of humanity which could have been realized in the light of the wealth of the society that already existed. Marx's central and most important insight was that this new dependence was not the consequence of the bad intentions of individuals or of a particular social group, but rather the inevitable implications of a specific socio-economic structure. More specifically, his task consisted first in the identification of a social class which more than any other had to be interested in the transformation of this economic structure. Secondly, in furnishing an irrefutable proof that the dynamics of the contemporary society made this transformation increasingly easier, even if one supposed that the minorities possessing interests in the perpetuation of the prevailing order would resist any reorganization of society. The smaller the privileged class, the greater is the privileged class's interest in the concealment of the real social conditions, and the less valid is the, quote, bourgeois economics, end quote, which in bourgeois economics, quote, heroic, end quote, early phase, had even once advanced a rudimentary critique of political economy on which Marx could build up his own theory. With these remarks, I am trying to indicate the possibility of an interpretation that encompasses Marx's writings as a whole. Up to this time, that inherent unity of his work has not been proved. I intend to do this by discussing the critical categories that Marx developed in the philosophic and economic manuscripts and in Marx's notebook of the mid-40s, and by showing that these categories are still the basis of the critique of political economy in Grundrisse der Kritik der politischen Ökonomie of 1857 to 58, as well as in Capital 1867, and were never disavowed by the old Marx. In other words, I intend to show that an interpretation of the early writings not only helps us to recognize the motives which led Marx to write a critique of political economy, Capital, but also in addition that the critique of political economy implicitly, and in part even explicitly, still contains that same critique of alienation and reification, which is the very topic of his early writings. A. Alienation and the reification of the work in the works of 1844. The manuscripts of 1844 had by and large been planned as a critique of political economy. In his introduction, Marx wrote that he wanted to publish successively brochures containing his critiques of law, ethics, politics, and so forth, and that he intended finally to approach the whole subject once again in a separate work. Marx, Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts. The starting point in this first attempt at a critique of political economy was the critical study of the, quote, political economy, end quote, to which Marx was led mainly by Engels', quote, outlines, end quote. As for the method to be used, Marx referred here, as in the introduction to his, quote, critique of the Hegelian philosophy of right, end quote, to Ludwig Feuerbach. Moreover, an explicit reference to Hegel's phenomenology of mind evidences an influence which can be traced even to the point of the manuscript's whole literal formulations. Quote, critique of political economy, end quote, at this time and later always meant first a critique of the capitalist economy accepted as absolutely rational by bourgeois economists, and secondly a critique of the corresponding theoretical self-consciousness. Yeah, that's a interesting. That's how I believe. I think the first person I heard say something like this was Paul Maddock Jr., who said something like, "Capital is fundamentally a critique of capitalism and its self-understanding as represented by political economy." In Marx's mind, this critique did not first of all and exclusively lead to a moral condemnation in the name of some absolute ethical norms. Rather, it was intended as proof of the deficiencies of the capitalist in all preceding modes of production, measured against and based on the standards of a truly human society, which had now objectively become possible because of the scientific and technological knowledge and wealth that the most developed nations had secured. Marx praised the historical achievements of capitalism for capitalism's superiority over all preceding modes of production, and to a corresponding extent criticized its limitations, the obstruction of further human progress. The early writings stressed the limitations, the repressions, the inhumanity, and the shortcomings of capitalism much more than any appreciation of capitalism's achievements, it is true. But it would be completely wrong to insinuate that in 1844 Marx radically and ahistorically condemned capitalism. As the main deficiency of the theoretical self-consciousness of the bourgeoisie, Marx considered As the main deficiency of the theoretical self-consciousness of the bourgeoisie, Marx considered its inability to grasp that capitalism was a phenomenon that had grown out of history and consequently was a relative and surmountable mode of production. Political economy starts from the fact of private property, but political economy does not explain private property to us. Political economy conceives the material process of private property in abstract and general terms, which then serve as its laws. It does not comprehend these laws. Shit, was that a quote? Motherfucker, I don't... that's annoying. It's like, I think that was a quote, but it doesn't represent itself as a quote. So let me start again. Let me reread that. Quote, political economy starts from the fact of private property, but political economy does not explain private property to us. Political economy conceives the material process of private property in abstract and general terms, which then serve it as laws. Political economy does not comprehend these laws, end quote, Marx. That is to say, the bourgeois political economy did not understand that these allegedly natural laws grew out of specific social relations of both production and property, and that these, quote, laws, end quote, only reflect human relationships which constituted themselves as quasi-objective and independent patterns vis-a-vis and opposite to the interacting individuals. In the manuscripts of 1844, Marx searched, quote, for the essential connection between private property, avarice, the separation of labor and capital and landed property, exchange and competition, value and the devaluation of man, that is, between this whole alienation and the money system, end quote, Marx. In this context, quote, money economy, end quote, stands as a metaphor for capitalism in which products and even individuals are degraded to the category of pure commodities, the value of which is totally distinct and finds its most complete expression in money, and its more and more abstract forms to the very credit system. As you may remember, Marx begins his discussion with the famous description of alienated labor, and he proceeds in 4 steps. Moreover, he refers to the same phenomena under various perspectives. 1. The alienation of the laborer from the product of the laborer's activities leads to a consolidation of the product as an independent power. As a result, this means that, quote, the worker becomes all the poorer the more wealth the worker produces, and the more the worker's production increases in power and range. The worker becomes an ever cheaper commodity the more goods the worker creates. The devaluation of the human world increases in direct relation with the increase in the value of the world of things, end quote. Marx. Hegel's conception of the humanization of man through a creative transformation of nature by work stands behind this description. Unlike the animal, man must become what man can be through labor. As an entity with only potential faculties, he can come to self-consciousness and to a conscious relationship with all other men only through an objectification of his powers. But this process, which is the more evident, the more perfect man's domination over nature becomes, leads to alienation as soon as the objects created by man stand, quote, alien and hostile, end quote, or in opposition to its creators, and as soon as the objects are subject to their own patterns of behavior and, quote, coldly, end quote, disregard the hopes, wishes, and aspirations of the individuals. 2. The alienation of the worker from the worker's product, from the perspective of the working class, appears as an alienation of the productive and creative activity itself. Alienated labor cannot be understood as a proper articulation of one's faculties, but a forced labor conceived simply as a means for sheer subsistence. Labor, therefore, does not live up to Marx's requirements. Labor is not, quote, the satisfaction bracket of a genuine human end bracket need, but only a means to satisfy needs external to labor. External to bracket, namely labor, end bracket, end quote. Marx. Since labor is not a pleasurable activity, but rather one of self-sacrifice and, quote, self-castigation, end quote, all human behavior consequently becomes perverted. At this point, Marx's arguments become more and more normative, but he nevertheless considers the standard of his critical appreciation as part of a historical analysis and as the expression of the anticipation of future possibilities, definitely not as a Wesenschau of allegedly eternal and moral norms. Quote, from all this, it can be seen that man, the worker, feels himself to be freely active only in the worker's animal functions, eating, drinking, and procreating, or at most also in the worker's dwelling and personal adornment, while in the worker's human functions the worker is reduced to an animal. The animal becomes human and the human becomes animal. Eating, drinking, and procreating are, of course, also genuinely human functions, but considered an abstraction from the sphere of all other human activity and turned into final and sole ends. Eating, drinking, and procreating are animal, end quote. Marx. If you aren't familiar with how I read things, I often try to follow the pronouns with, I don't know the fucking words, the proper noun. So if someone says man is his labor, I don't know, if man, something like, I don't know what's word. The dog loves its toy. I say the dog loves the dog's toy. I try to do that because I personally, especially when reading older texts, where they just go on and on using, say, it, like he and it and they and all kinds of things like that, I totally lose, because sometimes my short attention span loses the thread. So hopefully that's helpful to you as well, but if it's not, I apologize. If a man's productive activities are nothing other than forced labor necessary for subsistence and for that reason external to man, his interests shift entirely to those animal functions mentioned by Marx, or as we would rather say today, all of his aspirations become absorbed in his wish for further consumption made possible and imposed on him by modern economy. Moreover, this consumption has become more senseless in the same degree that his productive work has become more spiritless. 3. As alienation from his productive activity effected through indirect coercion or other directedness and not his own initiative and responsibility, the worker becomes alienated from the worker's species. To construe man's animal functions as man's proper functions means a loss of humanity itself. Quote, free conscious activity is the species character of human beings, end quote. And quote, productive life is species life, end quote. Marx. Only man can fail to realize his potentialities. Man's privileged status vis-a-vis the animal, which consists in man's faculty to turn external nature into man's, quote, inorganic body, end quote, is converted into a serious disadvantage because through alienation, man is deprived of his, quote, deprived of this, quote, inorganic body, end quote. 4. The immediate consequence of this alienation of the worker from the worker's species life and of humanity means the, quote, alienation of man from other men, end quote, which can most impressively be inferred from the relation between the sexes. The broad description of alienation can hardly be found in the later works of Marx, but we can assume that Marx did not question it later, and that it's consonant with the many hints in the Grundrisse 1857-58 and in Capital 1867. In contrast to these later works, Marx in 1844 had only a vague idea about the abolition of alienation. In any case, he did not then relate the revolutionary praxis to the self-antagonism of the capitalistic mode of production as directly as he did in later works. In 1844, his argumentation was as follows. The alienated relations to the labor product immediately produces the power of one person over other persons, just as religious alienation produces the power of a heavenly being over its believers. Private property no longer appears as the basis, but as the product and consequence of alienated labor. Quote, just as the gods originally were not the source, but the effect of the illusion of man, end quote. Marx. Only much later on, this relation becomes an interrelation. Okay, new section. The title is star. That's not a title, but just a break, you know what I mean? Marx believed that the solution to the problem could be found by putting the question in a different way. No longer did Marx seek the origin of private property, but rather the, quote, relation of alienated labor to the evolution of humanity, end quote. Quote, if one speaks of private property, one thinks of dealing with something outside man. Speaking of labor, one immediately deals with man. To state the problem in this way includes the problem's solution. End quote. Marx. The abolition of an alienated society can be carried out only by the workers. For the, quote, non-worker, end quote, it appears only as a state, Zustand, of alienation, whereas by the worker himself it is experienced as a, quote, activity, Tätigkeit, of alienation, end quote. Marx. By his alienated mode of production, the worker simultaneously produces the worker's self and the worker's opposite. The worker becomes a commodity, but is a, quote, self-conscious and self-active commodity, end quote. The worker obtains the basis for abolishing the entire world of commodities. Marx interprets this insight following Engels as a consequence of the evolution of economic theories from mercantilism to the physiocrats and the bourgeois political economy to the final socialist criticism. The theoretical development runs parallel to the development of civil society. By 1844, Marx knew that the victory of capitalism over all pre-capitalistic modes of production was a precondition for the abolition of all alienation. Marx separated the theories of the Aufhebung of alienated society into three logically successive forms. The first form of communism is merely the generalization of private property into communist property. This leads to crude communism. This is no connection between There is no connection between this way of abolishing private property and the real appropriation of alienated reality. On the contrary, all people would be reduced, according to this notion, to the unnatural simplicity of poor people without needs and wants. Quote, community, in this case, is only a community of labor and equality of salary paid out by the communist capital, the community as the universal capitalist, end quote. That seriously sounds like fucking Lenin's description of socialism as such, right? Equally paid employees of the state, right? It's kind of like his conception of socialism. Or at least, very least, the early stage of socialism. Which for him is socialism. The obvious indication of this kind of brute communism, which Marx understood as a primitive generalization of private property, is the Weibergemeinschaft, the community of women. This communism is inhuman because this communism destroys capitalism, but because this communism makes capitalism broader, more radical, and more absolute. This communism is inhuman not because it destroys capitalism, but because this crude communism makes capitalism broader, more radical, more absolute. This crude communism does not transcend capitalistic society, but even lags behind some of the more progressive aspects of private property. Nevertheless, Marx thought at this time that, at least from the theoretical point of view, this kind of communism was a stage through which one necessarily had to pass. The second type of communism Marx considered is of a political nature, democratic or despotic. It too remains imperfect and, quote, affected by private property, that is, the alienation of man, end quote. In its third form alone, quote, communism means the positive transcendence of private property and consequently a genuine reappropriation of the human essence by and for man, end quote. Marx. By this, Marx meant a society in which all people can freely employ all their manifold and differentiated faculties in order to be able to appropriate their products in the free and many-sided way of, quote, total men, end quote. In it, the mere possession of goods no longer prohibits the many-sided and more differentiated forms of appropriating humanized nature. The refined eye, ear, and emotions of all are now able to appropriate the past and present achievements of human creativity. A complete description of this unalienated society was furnished by Marx in his Excerpt Tefta, the notebooks written during this period, where Marx tried to show how in such a society the productive activities of free individuals are correlated and how these activities reflect the human species and not an alien, objectified, and reified world. In it, there would be no more greed, competition, profit-making, cheating, fraud, and exploitation. Rather, all relationships could be in harmony, and an atmosphere of love would be initiated by free consciousness so that all of man's activities would enrich man. B. The concept of alienation and reification as elaborated in the Grundrisse der Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, 1857 to 1858. Since the publication of the Grundrisse, which were edited in Moscow in 1939 and 1941, it is easier than before to prove the continuity of Marx's thought. These manuscripts date back to the time when Marx prepared the Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, published in June 1859, of which the first volume of Capital is but an enlarged and revised version. In the Grundrisse, Marx pondered problems and topics he had dealt with in his early writings and made use of the results of his more recent economic studies. The historical process which led to an extreme alienation of individuals from individual social relationships is described here in a more precise way than in 1844. In the money system, the intercourse of individuals with that entire society of which they are a part became completely objectified. Money has become an alien power to them. The individual, quote, carries his social power with his relationship to society in his pocket, end quote. Marx. Thus, quote, the activity of the product of quote, the activity in the product of activity is the exchange value, that is, a universal in which all individuality and particularity is negated and extinguished, end quote. Marx. The difference between modern and pre-capitalistic societies is to be found in the fact that the social character of their productive activity, the participation of the individual in the social production process, and the social character of the product today appear alien and contradictory to individuals. On the surface, no relations of personal dependency exist. Rather, all individuals appear as free, but in reality, everybody is totally subject to alien objective laws. Fremde Sachgesetzlichkeit. That result from blind social and economic processes. More than ever before, Marx emphasizes, however, at the same time the progressive and necessary character of these social relationships. Marx contrasts them to the restricted and limited relationships in previous modes of society, for example, to the patriarchal modes of antiquity and the Middle Ages. He welcomes the dissolution of small group subsistence economies and the development of the worldwide division of labor and the successive exchange of goods in the market as processes through which productivity is enlarged. Quote, the exchange is mediated exchange, value, and money presupposes mutually dependent producers and simultaneously the absolute isolation of the mutually dependent producers' private interests and a division of social labor, the unity and mutual complementarity of which must exist as a quasi-natural relation outside the individuals and independently of the individuals. The pressure upon each other of general demand and supply mediates the connection of mutually indifferent individuals, end quote, Marx. This corresponds very closely to the description of the system of wants and needs of the, quote, Not und Verstandesstaat, end quote, depicted by Hegel, which allegedly constitutes itself without the knowledge and will of the individuals through Adam Smith's, quote, invisible hand, end quote. Marx blamed the indifference of people for each other and the impossibility of facing up to their relationship to society. Marx blamed the indifference of people for each other and the impossibility of facing up to the relationship to society. But Marx clearly saw that the new mode of production was superior to all previous modes of production and that it simultaneously tended to destroy all genuine social relations and that it isolated the producers and consumers and that despite its immense wealth, it impoverished people in both literal and figurative senses, that is, the increasing specialization of skills and abilities prevented the individual from realizing all the individual's powers. Everybody must convert his product, his activity, into an exchange value, into, quote, money, end quote, because only in this and in no other form is to be found social power and indispensable power over others. From this fact, one realizes that, quote, people produce only for society and in society, end quote, and that, on the other hand, their production is not immediately social and not associatively organized. This means that everybody has to sell his product in order that he may take it over in the form of money as an objectification of the social character of his own production. In money, the individual producer acquires, though in alienated form, a part of social productivity. In money, he appropriates in alienated form, without knowing it, part of the community. Inasmuch as the division of labor extends over the whole world and leads to a world market with a worldwide currency, the intercourse of individuals becomes universal. But at the same time, as a result of these interrelations, the dependence of individuals becomes more and more radical. Thus, Marx could see in this status the transitory conditions leading to a new form of society and economy. Moreover, we must remember that Marx launched his polemic against any romantic glorification of, quote, natural, end quote, pre-capitalist conditions with their local, functional, and personal restrictions. He definitely preferred the worldwide interconnections of the participants of the capitalist world market, but Marx considered them as transitory and as necessary precondition to the future subordination of all social relations to the control of associatively organized producers, because Marx did not conceive any status as something occurring naturally, but as a product of historical praxis. Any status had been hitherto achieved in history without being consciously sought for. The present situation constitutes the precondition of a future society in which man as a whole being will be of real possibility. Man will no longer be a product of nature, but a product of history. In a word, this means that the total emancipation of man presupposes his total alienation. Armed with this historical insight, Marx thought it equally ridiculous to long for the, quote, original plenitude, end quote, of primitive social relations, or to hold fast to the human emptiness that marks the present. However, his essential point was that the bourgeois consciousness could not overcome the undialectical contrast of romantic aspirations and cynical acceptance of both a rich and an impoverished present. Quote, these contrasts comprise its being and will consequently remain with it to its end, end quote, Marx. However, progress towards a universal capitalistic mode of production does not appear only as a necessary precondition for the universal promotion of productive capacities. Rather, it leads to the final point where all personal relations are broken and subjected to the universal basis of new social interrelationships. As soon as most individuals are dominated by, quote, material conditions, end quote, or by socially objectified interrelations and not by other individuals, then the task for mankind is obvious: to bring these interrelations under mankind's common control and to break through the course of history where until now power elites have been circulating without ever facing up to the root cause of dependence and repression. Surely, as Marx stresses, quote, individuals are now dominated by abstractions, whereas individuals previously depended on each other, end quote. But these abstractions finally bring forth the preconditions on which all previous modes of domination rested. Throughout history, the dependence of, quote, slaves on the slaves', quote, masters, end quote, has not resulted from the will of the dominating classes, but can be explained only by the primitive modes of production and the necessities of those limited social conditions which required specific organizations, as for instance special military provisions, whereas in previous stages of history the objective conditions appeared as personal. Quote, in the modern world, the personal relations are clearly seen as pure expression of the modes of production and exchange, end quote. In the possibility of such an insight, Marx saw another important advantage of capitalist society. As I have already intimated, Marx in the Grundrisse elaborated on the notion that with which he first dealt with. As I've already intimated, Marx in the Grundrisse elaborated on the notion with which he first dealt in the philosophic and economic manuscripts, the notion that, quote, world history is nothing but the producing of man by man's work, end quote. More than the early writings, the positive meaning of the capitalistic mode of production is stressed, but the lines of argumentation are by and large the same as before. C. The fetish character of commodities and the concept of the destruction of alienation in Capital, the book. In Capital, the book, capitalist society is conceived of as a dialectical totality in which antagonisms tend to transcend present social conditions and are necessary at the same time. As with any totality, the parts reflect the whole, and every part is governed by the same principles as the whole. What characterizes capitalistic society is the commodity character capitalistic society attributes to everything. In the societies of Marx's time, this process of converting all things into commodities had not yet come to an end, but Marx thought that he could foresee that the process would closely follow this model. The dialectical reconstruction of social entities, which is possible only insofar as societies are truly governed by dialectical processes, does not construct the whole from its parts. This means that the presentation cannot properly begin until the analysis has been completed. In the beginning of Capital, Marx deals with the commodity. Everyone in a capitalistic society is familiar with commodities, but Marx wants to understand commodities in their historical genesis and becoming, and in their structure. In his study of the commodity character of products, his analysis from his early writings are still used and yet at the same time transcended. In the chapter mentioned, Marx analyzes the commodity in 4 steps. 1. The double character of the commodity is reflected upon. It represents use value and value. As use value, the commodity possesses specific qualities. As value, the commodity has no quality but represents a mere quantity. 2. This character of the product is traced back to labor's own twin qualities in a capitalist economy. On the one side, the worker produces particular work, besondere Arbeit, and the other as a result of their general work, allgemeine Arbeit. They produce exchange values. What Marx does is to probe backwards from the fixed being to the activities from which it results. 3. Marx shows historically how the value form had developed from the simple and accidental to the money form until the money economy The absolute split of use value from exchange value has become visibly evident. Now all products of human activities represent only money equivalents, and the general work of society is only able to recognize itself in this reified form. As a side note from myself, the narrator, I would say that this is a reproduction of the historical logical interpretation of the third section of the first chapter of Capital Volume 1. This interpretation of that section has been very much challenged. I don't think a lot of people very much accept it as like a historical, a very abstract historical gloss on how barter became money, how transition from barter to generalized commodity exchange. It's more viewed as like a logical derivation of the necessity of value being expressed in money. I think that's how, or maybe I'm misrepresenting the argument of people from like Neue Marktlektüre and value form analysis, but for a critique of the logical historical interpretation of this section, which was initiated by Engels, see the piece on my channel, The Myth of Simple Commodity Production by Christopher Arthur. It might be Chris Arthur or it might be C.J. Arthur. I don't know. He has signed his name differently in different places, so I'm not sure what that section is called, but check it out. 4. Marx analyzed the fetish character of the commodity and the commodity's mysteries. Quote, "The mystery of the form of commodity consists in the fact that for individuals, it reflects the social character of individuals' own work as objective qualities of the product of labor themselves, as social natural qualities of these things. Gesellschaftliche Natureigenschaften, and consequently, that it mirrors the social relations of the producers to the total work as a social relationship among objects existing outside them." End quote. Marx. The commodity character of a product of human activity consists in the phenomenon that this product possesses a value which can be abstractly expressed in money and therefore becomes interchangeable with other products. This quality of exchange and interchangeability appears as a quality of the object itself, a quality which is due to the objects being a part of the general world market, to the laws of which this commodity is subject. In reality, however, these reified relations of things reflect social relations of the producers and the owners of the means of production. Quote, "It is only the determinate social relation of individuals which takes the chimerical shape of the relation of objects." End quote. Marx. This phenomenon, that an entity resulting from the activities of individuals comes to dominate their life, can only be analyzed according to the way Feuerbach saw the relationship between God and man. Quote, "To find an analogy, we have to take refuge in the nebulous sphere of the religious world. Here the products of our imagination appear as independent, intelligent, and autonomous figures related to man. The same is true in the world of commodities, with the products of man's work. This I call the fetishism, which is attached to the labor products as soon as the labor products are produced as commodities, and which is by consequence inseparable from the production of commodities." End quote. Marx. As soon as people relate themselves to people's objects as to a fetish, people begin to attribute some qualities to this dead object which in reality stem from people's own life, the power and impotence of people's own social relations, for example. In other words, the magic power attributed to the fetish is real only insofar as belief in it makes possible the success of the tribe. But erroneously, this success is attributed to the fetish and not to the organized power of the tribe. Just as the interchangeability of the commodity is believed to due to the character of the products and not to the division of labor and the market mechanisms. There's a dearth of conscious organization of production in both cases. What Marx calls, in this context, fetishism, Marx described in his early writings as alienation. Let me quote one more sentence. Quote, "Its own social movement possesses for them, the producers of commodities, the form of a movement of objects, which the producers of commodities are controlled by rather than controlling." End quote. Marx. that the fetishism of commodities, that is, the mysticism of the commodity world, is only the specific expression of the capitalistic mode of production, is proved by Marx in his examples of Robinson and of the medieval mode of production. In both of these cases, the measure of value is regulated by the individual and social needs of specific use values. That is, the social character of production is presupposed, whereas in the commodity-producing society, the social character of the production of independently producing private workers is constituted in the process of circulation, and they're only in alienated form. In the Middle Ages, quote, the social conditions of individuals appeared in their works as their own personal conditions and were not concealed as the social conditions of objects, end quote. The relations were transparent and not mystified. Yeah, there's like a kind of like a contradiction, right? Is that, like I say in the Communist Manifesto, Marx says something to the effect is that where like all previous societies were kind of masked in like religious garb, the capitalism presents its relations to itself very explicitly in terms of just crass exploitation that's extremely visible in for instance, in like social conditions. I don't know if he says for instance, but like, whereas in this later work, he talks about the way that relationships of exploitation in capitalist societies are more mystified. And I think you can kind of say, the degree to which social relations are mystified, you can't really say that like, for my personal thing, and I think based upon like other things in Marx, is that especially in a religious age, where orders and rank were seriously bought into, the relations of domination were extremely mystified, which is what Marx says in the Communist Manifesto, at least as I remember reading it when I read it last. So it seems like it would be a mistake. I don't know. The mystification of social relations operates in different ways in different societies, right? I would not say that the fetishism of the tribe was a non-mystified society, and that's kind of like, I think there's kind of this push because of like post-colonial studies, and then like the violence of imperialism and the violence of colonization to be cautious about, like, rightfully so to a large extent, to be cautious about criticizing the irrationalism of pre-modern societies. But I think that Marx, and especially Cornelius Castoriadis, are, as a follower of this, are very much critical of the idea of like social relations being granted autonomized naturalistic powers, right? So like the fetish that holds together a tribe, that like fetishes and religious idols and things like that are problems. They're problematic for human freedom. So like that's, for Castoriadis to just as an extreme example, is like very much against the idea of human society visualizing itself as natural and not as a social construct. Full clarification of the social constructedness of human social life is a precondition for an emancipated social life. And these kind of like primitive societies where like self-consciousness of social construction is not apparent, makes them societies of under the sway of human-created self-alienated societies, I guess what to say. They're alienated, heteronymous societies that are not fully self-consciously um, making decisions about how to live, I guess. Um, like I think because we live in an age where people are very, very cautious about things like, I don't know, religious persecution in general, but also like Islamophobia, and especially is that due to like the war in Iraq and 9/11 and stuff. There's a big surge in the West of like viewing anybody who was Muslim or Arabic looking as potentially a terrorist or something like that. There's a because of that. There's been a degree to which in the left, there's been a degree to like abandoning like secularism, as secularism being like kind of like a Western chauvinistic kind of thing, and I think personally that it's a very very that was a very very negative development which came out of um, reasonable social concern to prevent discrimination against minority religions. But I think Marx, um, I think that like the concept of like an anarchism, and in Marx, like I think Rubel says like Marx wanted a stateless, classless, moneyless, godless society. I think the anarchist refrain of like no gods, no masters, uh, like putting like re-emphasizing at the very least secularism, if not atheism, um, into the center of like radical theory again, um, seems to be important, especially when you know not that like bourgeois society or like the West or whatever is not bereft of fetishism. It absolutely is, and that's kind of like the whole like idea of like critiquing commodity fetishism, right? Is that like Western civilization thinks it's so enlightened and stuff, but yet is characterized by this kind of like fetishism of its own daily practice, right? Um, but I think in our times there is very much a conflation and a confusion about what a progressive critique of capitalism and Western civilization, or whatever the hell that means, the modernity, an emancipatory, universalist, communist critique of modernity, versus kind of like romanticist, traditionalist, kind of like almost like or like traditionalist or like conservative or like reactionary like critiques of modernity, right? Like those things kind of collapse. And then so some people think that like, some people try to like think it's like really sticking it to capitalism and in some kind of emancipatory way to celebrate past systems or other systems of domination, including religious systems of domination, because they're ostensibly like earthy and like organic and like natural, or like of the people and rooted in community and place, and sometimes reaching into things that kind of sound like blood and soil romanticism. Like that critique and the progressive, universalistic, cosmopolitan, secularist critique of modernity is are very different, and I think should be distinguished. I think that we should focus on, I don't know, I'm sorry, I'm just rambling on here. It's kind of late in the night, so I'm kind of delirious. But I think, like, we should emphasize the dialectical character of enlightenment, which is not the same as rejecting enlightenment. We should see, like, the failure of enlightenment being due to the imperatives of capital and state, and their accompanying deployment of instrumental rationality, which is distinct from a rationality which takes human beings as ends in themselves and turns the means of production into means of emancipation and creates a world fit for human purposes. Yeah, we should return to that critical, like, defense of the Enlightenment, in spite of the catastrophes that came along with the thoughtless expansion of instrumental rationality, right? Prudential rationality, the successful achieving of goals without concern for humans as ends in themselves. Anyway, sorry, I'm fucking rambling on, but I hope maybe someone thought that was interesting or profound or something. But yeah. Anyway, back to the text. However, as we have already seen in his manuscripts of 1857, Marx rejects any romantic glorification of these older modes of production. The commodity-producing society with the commodity-producing society's alienation is obviously necessary as one transitory stage which lays the material groundwork for a new society. In Capital, Marx compared this new society as a, quote, association of free people, end quote, a term which he borrowed from Max Stirner, and which he mocked many times in other contexts. Quote, insofar as such an association works with socialized means of production and the individual is consciously... Insofar as such an association works with socialized means of production, and the individual is consciously organized their individual powers to a social power, then all determinations of Robinson's mode of production are reiterated, but now socially, no longer individually. Unquote. I think, and this is just my interpretation, this seems like what he's saying there is like with the Robinson thing is that like Robinson's taking account of like all these like different things, all these like ways that he's like dividing his labor, but because this labor is kind of like internal and not social, it's not a it's not a division of labor between separate autonomous producers, but a division of labor within one total producer. And so I think that's what's being said here is that like Robinson's like planned division of labor about all the things he needs for all the like, you know, different labors and use values that he needs, his planning of them without reference to exchange is now going to be a social field, right? So I think that that's kind of like a characterization of communism is like the socially planned, full, transparent coordination of labor and wealth creation on a free and equal basis, without a social division of labor between independent commodity producers, I think is what like how communism is characterized. So when it's this quote from Marx, it says, then all determinations of Robinson's mode of production are reiterated, but now socially, no longer individually. That means that there's all labor is now directly social and not indirectly potentially social, as is the case with the production of commodities. Commodities can always fail. Back to the text. So I can quote from Marx. The product of such an organized productive activity would immediately be social. See? and one part of it could remain social and be employed as a means of production, whereas another part could be distributed for the sake of individual consumption. Marx does not reflect in detail on the mode of distribution, but considers the mode of distribution dependent on the level of the producer's development. It might be organized along the socialist line of proportional distribution according to the amount of work performed by individuals, or along communist lines according to genuine human needs. And always keep in mind, this is just me again. Sorry, now I'm talking, now I'm feeling chatty. There could be combinations of these, right? So, like, there's no, like, for instance, even within capitalism, say, like, in certain places of the world, not in uncivilized hellholes like the United States, but say, like, Sweden or someplace like that, or like the UK when the National Health Service had better funding, certain utilities are viewed as, like, fundamental human rights, and so are free at point of use without charge, right? And so, like, in a communist revolution, you could have some kind of combination of, like, this kind of, like, from each according to ability to each according to their need for certain aspects of life, and then from each according to their ability to each according to their work, could be, like, another portion of it. And obviously, the ideal would be that that kind of, like, quid pro quo, this for that kind of relationship would be weeded out and only accepted as a very serious compromise in order to and that's the things, like, people, like the labor voucher system suggested by Marx or whatever, would be, like, very much something that should be avoided if it is possible. Anyhooser. If one looks only at the chapter on the fetish character of the commodity, one might believe that Marx expected the Aufhebung of alienation to be achieved solely through the common control of production based on the division of labor, and that he no longer challenged the principle of the division of labor itself. One could insinuate that Marx considered it sufficient that the sum of all individual labor forces become one social labor force, a situation which could be consonant with maintenance of division of labor. But Marx unmistakably stresses the necessity to overcome the division of labor. Marx's argument in Chapter 13 of the first volume of Capital, it is true, is based on the revolutionary character of technology and not on the individual's needs to develop the individual's own potentiality, but eventually it leads to the same conclusion as the early writings. Quote, if change of special work is carried through rather like some overwhelming natural law, and with the blindly destructive effects of a natural law which finds obstacles everywhere, then large industry, because of large industry's catastrophes, must make it a life and death matter to accept both the change of jobs and the greatest possible universality of the worker as a general social law of production, and to adapt the social conditions to the worker's normal realization. It becomes a question of life and death to replace the monstrosity of poor labor populations, a reserve held for disposition to meet the varying exploitation needs of capital, with the disposal of man for varied jobs, the partial individual (til individuum), the bearer of a partial social function, by the totally developed individual, for whom many social functions constitute successive modes of activity. End quote. Marx. It's interesting here because it seems like when people have, like, kind of like this critique of abstract labor as if it's like a particular type of labor, and not that abstract labor and commodity productions and market dependence does not have concrete material effects on how labor is performed and thus how it is experienced. That is absolutely true. But sometimes I feel like people, like, criticize abstract labor because it's, like, I don't know, kind of indifferent, kind of, like, generalized, like, labor as such being, like, bad, like, or, like, and, like, kind of like this interchangeability of just, like, different types of labor in the process, like the it being somehow it being easy to jump from task to task being like some kind of state of like degradation or something, which I think there's some merit to that. But it seems like right here, if you're looking at this passage, it seems like the abstract character of labor, in some sense, would persist in a non-commodity producing society. So that's kind of very interesting there. I mean, maybe I'm misinterpreting that, but it seems, I don't know. I have that's kind of like like a lot of people like fucking like Moish Pistone and like value criticism people like Robert Kurtz or Anselm Joppa or Ernst Lohoff or Norbert Trenkel or whatever, or Roswitha Schultz. Like they kind of have this idea of like they kind of have this like bizarre, like kind of like a weird idea of like abstract labor actually being like a type of labor, and I think this is generally like considered like a general phenomenon that probably extends beyond these people. Whereas for me, like the way I understand abstract labor is that it's a fundamental, it's the way that it's the abstract dimension, the value dimension of labor in a commodity producing society, right? So in capitalist society, in commodity production, there's all kinds of concrete labor, but that concrete labor only counts as abstract labor insofar as it produces a commodity which is socially validated by exchange. If that commodity fails to be exchanged, I don't know if you can say that the labor that was concretely put upon it would count as abstract labor, because it never becomes part of the totality of the social process. I just think of abstract labor as like the socially necessary abstract labor time, right? So, and that socially means, to me at least, means like socially needed as well, right? So, like, you might produce something at the average, if something's produced at exactly the socially necessary average, if more of that particular commodity is being produced than the market can stomach, that labor is wasted, and that labor is not abstract labor, even if on a temporal way it conforms to socially necessary labor, because it falls outside the realm of demand in a market society. That labor was not abstract. It might have had market imperatives pressing down on it, but it was not fundamentally abstract labor, or proved to be abstract labor by its ex post realization on the market. Where was I going with that? So, like, it seems to me, I feel like that's an important thing that Marxists should emphasize in their when they're trying to explain like the Marxian conception of value to other people, is that notions of supply and demand are wrapped into it, right? Like, if something like a commodity doesn't have value if it's radically produced beyond demand. So if like if a commodity is produced below demand, like, I don't know, it's complicated. But I think that like social need and supply and demand and those kind of like concepts of conventional economics are like fundamentally rolled in a certain sense, on a very abstract level, of course. To get to how supply and demand actually affects, you have to go into like prices of production, market value, market price, and so on and so forth, and understand like supply and demand on that more like empirical register. But on a very like abstract level, part of socially necessary labor is labor that is can be socially validated, actually be socially validated by exchange on the market. At least that's how I understand it. Where was I going with that? Yeah, basically just saying that demand is not something that's totally disregarded in the concept of value, even at a very high level of abstraction. It's just insufficient to reduce, but it's like obviously for Marx, and I think actually is the case, when supply and demand are in equilibrium, it doesn't explain anything. It doesn't explain like the quantitative difference. Like if like supply and demand perfectly align, it doesn't explain why like a car has more value than a banana. Like once supply and like what is that? Once they're in demand, there's still a quantity there, and how does that quantity come from? I think that's what like the Marxian value theory, at least on its like quantitative register, is trying to explain. But anywhoser. Back to the text. The quote total man, end quote, whom Marx postulated in his early writings as a contrast image to the impoverished, one-sided, crippled individual who really existed, is here conceived as a necessity to which the capitalist mode of production itself is pushed. This is one of the many observations by which Marx showed himself far ahead of his time, for not until recently was there a widely shared opinion that modern modes of production requires not over-specialization, but a mode of comprehensive training of the laborer to allow himself to adapt himself to the ever-changing requirements of industrial production. Okay. This is the final section. It says some final remarks. Section 3, final remarks. So I don't know how long this is, but I thank you for listening to me like talk to myself. I actually feel like I said some things that actually made some kind of sense there, but maybe I didn't, but hopefully I did. Nobody would deny that the style and ambiance did change in Marx's writings. There is indeed a difference between the sober explication in Capital, with its emphasis on theoretical vigor and empirical detail, and the critical and moralistic-sounding analyses of 1844. But there remains one fundamental topic, which is the starting as well as the ending point, the quest to transcend capitalist society towards a more human, free, and satisfactory society. There is no warrant for the conclusion that the old Marx buried the hopes of his youth and abandoned the fulfillment of his aims. His later writings can be adequately understood only in the light of his first writings. If later the quote how end quote of this transformation and its empirical chances of realization were more stressed more strongly than the necessity of the quote that end quote, of which Marx remained too deeply convinced to need stressing, this should not be mistaken for escape into a general philosophy of history or an exclusive concentration on the analytical restructuring of the capitalist economy. Marx's intentions throughout his life were directed towards a quote critique of the political economy end quote. And critique of political economy means the practical critique of capitalist society as much as the critique of political economy does as much as it does its theoretical conception in the doctrines of bourgeois economists. Marx did not bring forth a new proletarian economic theory to stand beside the classical bourgeois theories, and the widespread notion of a, quote, economic theory for the proletariat, end quote, sometimes sanctioned by Marx and Engels themselves, is by and large misleading. In Capital, Marx reflections centered around a critique of those alienated social relations Marx had already criticized in 1844. If Marx, and particularly Engels later on, were not always conscious of the continuity of this critical approach, this would not amount to a serious objection against my interpretation. Capital remains a fragment, and being bound to the galley of his journalistic writings, Plagued by illness and lack of genuine enthusiasm, overwhelmed by organizational duties, Marx was no longer able to ponder his work and treat it as a whole. His successors had already begun during his lifetime to pick out pieces of his theoretical reflection which they found expedient for their immediate political and organizational aims. The story of the interpretation of Marx's work was, as in all cases of great thinkers, a story of misinterpretations. All right. Well, that's it. Thank you so much for listening, and especially thank you for listening to me talk about like my own opinions. I know it's a little tedious, and I know you didn't sign up to hear some fucking anonymous asshole on the internet talk about what he thinks is abstract labor and is not abstract labor. But I really appreciate you listening to this to the end, and thank you for your patience. You have a wonderful day or evening or night, and I hope your lives are filled with lots of love and joy and worthwhile activity.